To take their seats, I'd like to start up the next panel. And before I do so, I want to thank the sponsors. I want to recognize again that we can't bring CHOW to you all here in the room. We certainly can't bring CHOW to our online audience without the help of many, many sponsors. And you'll find the names of the program. You'll find the names on the slides as they run through. And I'd like to ask for a round of applause for everybody who helps make CHOW possible. While you find the sponsors on the slides and the programs, I'd like to give a special recognition to our exhibitors, starting with NOAA and DOI, who have exhibits out on the side. XL Catlin, Auburn University, IFAW, International Fund for Animal Welfare, Pew, Esri, and Marco. And if you haven't been by their booths yet, I encourage you to do so at the next break. Many of you guys have been using our mobile app and really enjoying CHOW virtually this year. Thank you for doing so. It saves a little bit of paper and makes CHOW a little greener. At the same time, we want to be a little bluer. But there are some important materials up at the front, up at the registration desk, that you might not have and that I want to call out. The first is the Capitol Hill Ocean Talk programming schedule. And that's being run by NOAA's Oceans Live team next door in our studio. And in between breaks and for tomorrow's lunch, please tune in to Capitol Hill Ocean Talk. They've got sessions that are just as interesting, if not more so, that we have here. Secondly, there's some collateral that you will find in the pamphlets out front. One is the latest edition of Sanctuary Watch. And if you do want to remain paperless, you could get that copy of Sanctuary Watch on the NOAA Sanctuary website. I encourage you to look at it. It's all about building coalitions, and that's been a lot of the discussion we've had here to date. And then lastly, as part of the packages, you'll find the new National Marine Sanctuary Foundation one-pager that, again, presents part of the new look and feel that you're seeing with our new logos, our new campaign. And so I encourage you to go back and get that. One of the most important pieces of paper that you'll find, but that will be incorporated into the mobile app, is the addenda for speakers that have been added to the roster too late after the program was printed. And on that list, thanks to being flexible, is today's moderator, and that is Brian Scheid, who spent 5 years at Platts, currently serving as senior editor for Oil News. And Mr. Scheid comes with a lot of experience covering a lot of different beats, from the White House to Congress to many different agencies across the federal family, looking at many different subjects. He currently serves as co-host of Platts Capital Crude. And I will assume that crude has a particular meaning in that term.
Well, yeah.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing.
And one thing that we have learned in hosting Capitol Hill Ocean Week for the last several years, the best moderators often are journalists for the way they approach their profession. And so it's really wonderful to have Mr. Scheid as our moderator today.
Great, thank you so much. So this is going to be a panel on offshore energy. We're hopefully going to cover a lot of topics today. The controversial plans to drill offshore Alaska this summer. You know, you've probably heard of this in the news. There's also other potentially controversial plans to drill offshore the Atlantic coast within about 7 years. We'll get to offshore wind, as well as how to finance this new world of offshore energy amid climate change and everything else that's going on, and what this all means with relatively low oil prices and this record domestic supply we're seeing, mostly coming from onshore. So to start things off, I'd first like to introduce Walter Cruikshank. He is the Deputy Director of the Interior Department's Bureau of Energy Management, or BOEM as it's more commonly known, which oversees U.S. offshore energy development. And I'd like to give him just a brief chance to introduce himself and give a commercial for BOEM, if you will.
Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about offshore energy's outlook and BOEM's role in that. It's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, part of the Department of Interior, as Brian noted, and we're responsible for overseeing all energy and mineral resources under federal jurisdiction offshore. So that's conventional energy, renewable energy, and minerals, including sand, used for coastal resilience projects. We have quite a lot going on. It's been in the news over the past several months. On the renewable energy side, we are taking an approach of trying to identify areas that are suitable for wind development, while at the same time trying to reduce conflict with other uses and environmental resources to a manageable level. On the Atlantic, we've issued 9 commercial wind energy leases off 5 states from Massachusetts down to Virginia. And we're working on planning auctions off of 4 more Atlantic states as well. There's also some wind energy projects in the Pacific, notably a demonstration project offshore Oregon to test floating turbine technologies, as well as some recent applications for wind off Hawaii. And we're also working on marine hydrokinetic energy as well. We have a lease issued offshore Florida for testing devices to capture energy from ocean currents. And we're working on one for a plug-and-play test berths for wave energy devices offshore Oregon. For conventional energy, of course, our major program is the oil and gas leasing program. Back in January, the Secretary issued her draft proposed program, the first of 3 programs required under the law for developing a schedule for 2017 to 2022. This builds on our approach of regionally tailored leasing, trying to recognize the specific characteristics of different areas in designing a lease program. And this calls for lease sales in Gulf of Mexico, offshore Alaska, and potentially offshore the Atlantic, and is informed both by the areas of high resource potential, industry interest, coastal states that have expressed interest in learning more about the resources off their coast, while also looking to environmental resources and other uses. As we look at these areas, we're going to continue to try and collect a lot of scientific information to inform our decision making. That's sort of the third leg of our bureau. We have a robust environmental studies program that's constantly on the cutting edge of ocean science research, partnering with other federal agencies, academic institutions, and others to provide us the sort of information we need to try and make sound decisions to balance our dual missions of both promoting energy exploration opportunities offshore while protecting the marine and coastal environments.
Great, thanks, Walter. Up next, we have Conrad Spangler III, Director of the Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy, which is involved in all the energy development in the state of Virginia.
Okay, Brian, thanks. And also I'd like to thank the foundation for sponsoring this event and allowing us to be here. That just the view and the venue here are the kinds of things that cause you to look out and just to be inspired. And it's just great to be here. And it's thinking about Virginia and why the offshore and energy is important to us. Is that before the Jamestown settlement, Virginia has been well known for its port facilities, for its location here along the mid-Atlantic seaboard. And through the years, we've grown tremendously in import-export activities through the maritime industry, tourism, the fishing, both sport and commercial. There, as well as the military, that just offshore of Virginia, you'll find probably the greatest concentration of military ships and planes of anywhere in the world. And so all of this together is what makes Virginia unique and what makes us interested in offshore development that may go on there, that we're interested in the environmentally sound activities that are there and things that can be compatible with all of the other ocean uses. And that's why a forum such as this and other processes that we're involved in, we believe are so beneficial to us. Governor Terry McAuliffe has determined that he wants Virginia to grow and to diversify and to strengthen its energy mix. Virginia is an energy negative state, as most states in our nation are. We import more energy than we produce and use. And in electricity, we import nearly 40% of all the electricity that's used throughout the customer base in the Commonwealth. We do have a fairly diverse energy mix. We're about 40% nuclear generation, about 30% coal, 30% gas, and natural gas is increasing considerably. And so we're looking at the opportunities for renewables such as offshore wind as well as tide and wave technology. We also are looking from an energy security standpoint at oil and gas and what the potentials may be there. And so we have stepped forward just this spring. A couple of things that are new to Virginia and maybe new in our discussion is the first ever offshore wind energy research lease that Walter and the folks at BOEM were able to award to our department. We've partnered with Dominion Virginia Power, our largest power provider in the Commonwealth, to build demonstration turbines in the offshore area to be able to prove the technology and also to bring down the cost and the reliability and reduce the risk that's there. Also, we've just completed an analysis of the capabilities and the preparation that we may have to support offshore oil and gas exploration and hopefully ultimately development. And through those analysis, we're able to show that the facilities do exist that could support those industries and that there would not be build out that would be needed for probably into the year 2030 and beyond if that industry were to mature. So we're glad to be here. Energy is important to Virginia from a security standpoint, an economic standpoint, but also for the environmental aspects of it as well. So thanks, Brian, and look forward to the panel.
Great, thanks a lot, Conrad. Up next, we have Randall Luthi. He is the president of the National Ocean Industries Association, which goes by NOIA. I hope I got that right. He's also the former director of the Minerals Management Service, and he's going to give us some insight into the future of the offshore industry.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank, first of all of you for returning from lunch and willing to come into a panel discussion. I was just fascinated by the topic of the panel, and as I'll paraphrase it, as shaping our energy outlook in these uncertain times. And I got to thinking, whenever you're dealing with offshore energy, it is an uncertain time. I don't care what it is. Right now, we're going to talk probably some about the low oil prices. But again, what a strange time that is. I mean, I'm guessing, how many of you drive or own a vehicle? Just give me a rough idea. Yeah. Don't you love going to the gas station right now? I mean, isn't it interesting? Yeah, that you're able to fill it up, certainly compared to a year ago. But on the flip side, we have thousands and thousands of employees out of industry that is being laid off. So it's just, again, an uncertain time, but certainly uncertainty is far more than just oil and natural gas prices. It deals with a federal regulatory climate. It deals with a state regulatory climate. The oil and gas industry, as well as the wind industry, is very global in nature. And frankly, the industry is going to go where it is allowed to look for and produce natural resources, whether it be oil, natural gas, wind. That's where they're going to be looking at. And as we go down and look at the future, I'll quote some of the EIA statistics. A lot of people are pushing, we got to get rid of the traditional fuels. We got to get off of them. And there's various reasons, and I think we'll get into that. But the reality is, in the year 2040, at least EIA predicts that 89% of the U.S.'s energy sources are going to be those conventional, as Walter said, or traditional sources of energy: oil, natural gas, coal, nuclear. The more non-traditional, such as biofuels, renewables, 11 or so percent. I personally think that's going to be much higher than that because, I mean, everybody wants to develop all sources of energy. But let's go way out on a limb and say it's 20% or even 25%. That still means we need to have a sensible, rational way of developing those traditional sources of energy as well, in a way that's safe and is also as beneficial to our economy and the environment as can be. So I look forward to that kind of discussion today. Thank you very much, Brian.
Great, thanks a lot, Randall. Up next, we have Rolando Murillo, an equity analyst with Rockefeller Asset Management. He works with the Sustainability and Impact Investment team there, and he's going to talk a lot about the impact of climate change and investment.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the time this afternoon, especially to National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. What I'd like to do is give you a little bit of background as to what we do at Rockefeller Asset Management. We used to be the family office for the Rockefeller family, and we are now an asset management firm, not only managing money for high net worth individuals, but also institutional mandates. Within the sustainability and impact investment team, we focus on environmental, social, and governance factors in addition to your traditional financial analysis. What I'd like to add to this panel, and I find this topic very interesting and timely, is the discussions around carbon, what that means on the long-term standpoint. I believe you mentioned recently, the potential for renewables. What we like to do is really assess what the carbon profile is for individual companies. We'd like to use that as a measurement tool, and we also are looking for opportunities within this realm. For us, this is important, but it's also demanded by our clients. Our clients are wanting this information, not only because it's of interest to them, but it's also part of just the fiduciary responsibility of managing a portfolio. What my work and my team's work is doing right now is not only assessing carbon profiles of companies, but also of our portfolios as well. This is leading into a very interesting discussion with our companies. One of the main activities that we do is we engage with companies. We are very pragmatic about the development of renewables because we also do hold fossil fuel holdings within our portfolios, but we want to challenge our companies in discussing and being transparent about how they incorporate sustainability issues, how they incorporate climate change, and how they view these things over a long-term time horizon. So we can give you my assessment and our perspective of how we view these things from a long-term energy and a low-carbon transition profile.
Great, perfect. Last but not least, we have Brian Redmond. He is a principal with Paragon Energy Holdings and the Paragon Asset Group. He is also a board member with Deepwater Wind, so we look forward to hearing a lot about that. So go ahead, Brian.
Great, thanks everyone. It's a fairly august group up here, and we're going to see a lot of confluence between government, between industry, between the financial resources, and kind of owner-operator resources. So at Paragon, we own and operate energy projects across the country, including 750 megawatts of onshore wind in upstate New York and Texas, and as Brian mentioned, Deepwater Wind, which is building the first offshore wind project off Block Island, Rhode Island. I've been on the board since 2006, and it's been a long road. Turbine foundation loadout happens June 26, where the foundations will be taken from the Gulf of Mexico yards where they're being built, sailed up along the East Coast, and placed off Block Island this summer. Then next summer, we'll go through the installation of the topsides and the turbines. So it'll be very exciting to see steel in the water finally in the offshore wind space. And what I can talk about today is give you a sense of where the industry is offshore wind in the US, where it is in Europe, and what's been driving the two different tales of two cities. We've got a very much of a success story in Europe with 8,000 megawatts of offshore spinning wind, and we've got 30 megawatts in the US. Why? And so we'll talk a little bit about that today, what the drivers are, what the considerations are, and how we play that going forward.
Perfect, great. Also, everyone in this room should have cards if you have any questions. You can pass those on if you have them. Also, would be, if you really want to get your question asked, it's best to attach a $10 bill to the question. Also, if you're online and you tweet hashtag CHOW 2015, and we'll try to get those questions asked as well. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today on offshore energy, carbon, wind, 5-year plans. But let's start with what's in the headlines right now. Let's start with Walter. You've got CHI activists, you've got Shell No protests going on in Seattle, you've got activists being arrested, grabbing a lot of the headlines. But this is all in opposition to Shell's plans to drill in the Arctic offshore Alaska this summer. Can you give some background as to the Obama administration's thinking on that decision to give conditional approval to Shell?
Yes, Brian. The decision to allow Shell to proceed conditioned on getting the additional permits they need from other federal agencies is really based on the fact that we believe inherently that drilling can be done safely and responsibly in the Arctic if it's subject to the right safeguards. And a lot of what the Department of Interior has been doing over the last few years has been trying to really up our game, if you will, on the sorts of safeguards and requirements we're putting on folks that are drilling in the Arctic to make sure that work can be done safely and responsibly. As Randall noted earlier, administration, while moving forward to try and get to a clean energy future, does believe that that's decades away at best, and that fossil fuels are needed in the meantime, and that it's important for this country to show some leadership among all the nations that are looking for oil and gas in the Arctic, to show some leadership on how that can be done in a responsible manner, and that's what we're aiming to do.
So this administration has pushed back some controversial decisions. Keystone XL, probably the most infamous of them. This is such a controversial decision, and we're only now, I believe it's July that Shell starts drilling. Why not delay a decision? Why not take some additional time for review on this before giving them conditional approval?
Well, there's been a lot of review of this project. Remember, there are plans as well for earlier drilling there. So we think there's been a lot of work done into understanding the environment in the Arctic, a lot of work done to understand what conditions we wanted to place on Shell as they operate there. And we felt we had the information to go forward with the decision at this time.
So the big fear, obviously, is an oil spill. This area that Shell plans to drill in is incredibly remote. I know there's been some new rules put into place to safeguard against this. Maybe you can give us some background on that as well. But what assurances can you offer, those of us in the crowd, that a disastrous oil spill won't take place?
Well, there is no such thing as risk-free activity, but this is an area where the geology itself does not suggest you could have the sort of catastrophic spill that people picture. And there's a lot of safeguards in place, both in terms of the drilling technologies themselves and the requirements we're putting around the operations to make sure that should there be an incident, that there is a lot of resources there to react quickly to that and keep anything from reaching a catastrophic level. So there are going to be controls on the drilling itself. Our sister agency, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, will have inspectors on 24/7 while drilling operations are ongoing. And Shell is going to have a flotilla of vessels there that are ready to support any activity that might be needed as the drilling program proceeds.
Great, and I'd like to get Randall to chime in on this as well, but this is to you, Walter. But shortly before the Obama administration announced this conditional approval on Shell, they unveiled their own Arctic regulations. They also put millions of acres on and offshore Alaska off limits to oil and gas leasing. So can you say that the Obama administration is really for oil and gas development, or does it see it more as a necessary evil that has to go along with something as they move to this carbon-free or low-carbon energy future?
Those aren't the sorts of labels I would put on the decisions. The approach of the administration has been to try and find the right balance between the need for orderly development of OCS resources while protecting important environmental and cultural resources. And what was done in Alaska was to take a look at the highest resource potential areas, take a look at some of the particular areas of high environmental value or subsistence use by Native Alaskans, and try to find the right balance of what areas to potentially make available and what areas to set off limits to protect those resources that we feel ought to be protected.
Great. And so, Randall, I'll rephrase that a little bit, but does the industry see the administration as a conduit to offshore oil and gas development, or is it more of a hurdle?
Oh, what a question, Brian. And you probably see me tapping my toes on that, on things. I know many of you will be shocked, but I haven't always been a great fan of the administration's policies on oil and gas development. I know you're shocked. I know you are. But in this case, I think they absolutely got it right. Alaska development, Arctic development is not new to the world. It is new to some degree to the United States. but it's not new to many of the industries that are, again, a global industry worldwide. Norway, Russia have long been in areas that are very similar. The Alaska waters are relatively shallow. We're dealing with hundreds of feet, not thousands of feet. Shell has committed to bring with them. I know we hear a lot of criticism, well, there's no response vessels up there. And you're right, there are no response vessels right there. They come with Shell. And it's not a thing that you build it and they will come, is you build it as you start doing the exploration. And that would be true for the Arctic, that will be true for the Atlantic. But we're very favorable that Shell will be able to meet the requirements, but it does take a partnership. And it does take cooperation between the federal regulators and industry. We need to make sure that the best technology is available and being used, and that everything is there. You can't, I'd love to tell you, I can tell you, no, there will not be any kind of an incident. But no one can say that. And really on any kind of energy development or almost any activity, leaving your door, you can't guarantee there won't be some kind of an incident. But we're very pleased with the administration's decision to move ahead. One of the things is we just need to know what's there. You know, there's some early testing indicating that it could be a great potential in the Arctic. You don't know until you actually drill a hole and see if there's something in there. You know, this may be, you know, who knows? It may be a dry hole. Nobody expects that it will be. But, you know, it wouldn't be the first time that's happened to industry. So, again, industry moves on carefully. They need to be careful. There's plenty of lessons to be learned. But, again, it's not new, and it can be done safely.
You know, Randall, following up on that, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, Statoil, they've all put their Arctic plans on hold, kind of waiting to see what Shell does. In your mind, for one, to Shell, and also for the industry as a whole, how important is this summer drilling season? You know, if they have another repeat of 2012 and there's more missteps, does it sort of put this Arctic development off for decades?
Everybody's looking at the Arctic, everybody's looking at Alaska, and everybody is focused in on Shell. And that really puts them right in the center of, I don't want to necessarily a bullseye, but it's certainly they're in the center of a lot of binoculars looking at them. So what they do is important. And you're right, the other companies have pulled back, said, let's see how Shell does. Let's see what kind of requirements they get hit, or not hit with, but which ones they're able to meet, what kind of agreements they can reach. And let's see what kind of success they're going to do. It isn't important. Do you keep putting it off for years? That's one option. I don't think that's the best option because, again, if you want safe, good development, you need to start. The United States is actually somewhat in the back row when it comes to Arctic development. We need to move ahead with it.
So that leads right into my next question. If the U.S. doesn't develop its Arctic resources right now, its oil and gas resources, I should say, is there a fear that Russia overtakes them or Norway or some other country sort of gets a step ahead of the U.S. and we lose a lot of footing in this?
Well, certainly Russia or Norway wouldn't be developing resources in U.S. waters.
Right.
But certainly they're already ahead in overall Arctic development off their own shores. So there is always that possibility. But again, long term, most offshore projects, particularly oil and gas projects, are long term in nature. They're going to take a few years to develop. You not only after you find the oil and gas, you got to find out and figure out a way to get it safely somewhere. You've got to get it to the market. And so that's going to take a few years of planning and development as well. But these leases that we talk about were actually purchased in 2008. So they've been on the books a long time. And you normally have, and let me put the magic quotation marks around, normally have 10 years to develop your offshore leases. And of course you can get extensions if certain things are right. But companies need to, they just can't sit on them. They've got to do something with them or they go back and can be sold again.
And now the price of oil is about $60 a barrel. Again, you're seeing these protests in Seattle. You know, there's the inherent risk of an oil spill. I guess if you could just give sort of a justification, why, if you could develop this onshore and there's already this glut of U.S. oil, why would you develop oil and gas offshore?
Sure. Again, let's look at it from the long-term view. Oil and gas, particularly offshore, can provide a piece of that of energy that's going to be needed in the year 2020, 2025, 2040 possibly. But if you don't start soon, you just don't get it developed. Everybody has the right to protest, and I understand that. But we should also be listening to many of the Alaskans as well. I mean, some are very supportive of it that live on the North Slope, some are not. But we need to move ahead. And that not only is Arctic. I think you're going to see as we talk about onshore development, again, it's an interesting time. 10 years ago, if I'd have told you the United States would be a leading producer in gas, I mean, world leader and producer in gas, and pretty much in oil, I wouldn't have believed it. And I'm in the business. So it's also a geopolitical change. And I think the United States, if they want, will hopefully maintain that leadership role, because there's a great opportunity to help provide energy. There's a great opportunity to solidify the economy. And there's a diplomatic role, as you have seen as other countries has used natural resources as a tool. This is an opportunity for the United States to lead and be an example.
And Walter, from this example of where prices are at right now, with the risks, with the onshore glut, I don't know a better way to put it, are you getting a sense at all from the industry that they're less interested in pursuing offshore development?
We're really not getting that sense at all. Offshore right now accounts for about 20% of the oil produced in the United States, and it's projected to increase production over the next few years. But as Randall said, these are long-term projects. So when folks are investing in the sorts of projects that may take 10 or 15 years to reach production, they're not looking at what's happening today as much as they're looking at what are conditions going to be like 10 or 15 years down the road. And so that's what they're planning for. And with continued global growth in energy demand over that period, and what we know about where resources are globally, the expectation is that those resources will be needed globally and in this country to try and maintain reasonable energy prices.
Great.
Sorry, we're all out of time now for the rest of you guys. But
But moving away from the Arctic, let's get into the 5-year plan for oil and gas leasing that's sort of making its way through the approval process with the administration. It calls for sales offshore Alaska. It calls for sales in the Gulf of Mexico again, I should say. A possible sale off the Atlantic coast, where we can bring in Virginia on this. But it doesn't include sales offshore Florida. It doesn't include sales in the Eastern Gulf. I have a number of 14 potential lease sales in 8 of the 26 possible offshore planning areas. So, Randall, would you depict this plan or proposed plan as disappointing?
We didn't give it a whole lot of, we didn't give it any jeers, but I can't say that we gave it a whole lot of cheers as well. And I know this is also going to be a shock to all of you here, but these 5-year plans are largely political in nature, and that comes from someone who helped develop a 5-year plan. So, I paint myself with the same broad brush as everyone else. You do base it upon what you think the resources are there, but you also involve governors of the coastal states. You involve political leaders. You make decisions. As you know, the White House is always involved when a 5-year plan comes out. So it's more of a political type plan. Would we love to see more areas? Absolutely. Certainly one of the most logical areas, if you were going to increase, would be the Eastern Gulf of Mexico, because you already have the infrastructure in the central and western part of Gulf of Mexico. You have the equipment, you have the companies, you have the industry. You already see that the Gulf of Mexico, how compatible it is with fishing, with wildlife. It's a fascinating community down there that has spent the last 40 years actually living with each other and making these two kinds of industries, both tourism, fishing, and commercial fishing and industry, actually live together and all thrive together, which is hard for most people to realize that if you haven't been in that area. So we're absolutely thrilled about the idea of reopening the Atlantic, and let me say it is a reopening. back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and early 80s. There was a lot of seismic testing. There even were a few wells drilled along the Atlantic. This is an opportunity to look at that again. All that data is really very old. There's a new way to test this data. They found on, well, some companies think that there are similar formations off the west coast of Africa are also found off the southeast coast of the United States. They have found oil and gas off the west coast of Africa. Does that mean it could be in the southeast? We don't know. But the important thing is you get an opportunity to look and to find out. And I think that's what everybody should be concerned about. You want to know what's there. And seismic alone won't do it. You're going to have to do some actual exploration. But like all 5-year plans, you know, we have submitted our comments and we'll continue to work with the administration. And we would, of course, like to see more sales offered.
Okay, and I'd like to turn to Virginia in 1 second, but first, Walter, could you give some background as to why the Eastern Gulf wasn't included, why the Pacific wasn't included, why it was limited to only these 8 planning areas?
I could probably fill up the rest of the panel, but I'll try and be brief. With respect to the Eastern Gulf, it's important to note that Congress has put a law in place that leaves it off limits through the middle of 2022, which encompasses the 5 years that we're currently planning for. So that has a lot to do with what we're looking at with respect to the Eastern Gulf. With respect to the other areas, we're looking at a combination of things, where we believe the resources are, where industry has told us they're interested in looking, as well as a lot of input from the states themselves. And so you're seeing areas offered where states have expressed some interest in learning more about the resources that lie off their coasts, and areas like the West Coast where there's very clear message from across the spectrum of state leadership that are not interested. Those aren't being offered. And when you say out of 26, you got to recognize that the majority of those planning areas are actually offshore Alaska,
Right.
and many of them are remote even by Alaskan standards, and there's no particular interest in them.
Great. So Virginia is a state which is interested in this development. The 5-year plan for a potential sale calls for one off the Atlantic coast, Georgia, North and South Carolina, and Virginia. Conrad, what do you see as the likelihood of that sale taking place, considering it is kind of in that 2022 picture, sort of at the back end of the 5-year plan? What do you see the likelihood of that taking place offshore Virginia?
Okay, thanks for that. And we're very optimistic and hopeful. And actually, as was pointed out earlier, the Atlantic has been explored, and there have been about 50 wells that have been drilled in the Atlantic. None of them are in production today. There are close to 50,000 line miles of seismic data that we've looked at historically that's there. So quite a bit is known about the mid-Atlantic and off of the Carolinas. What we believe, though, is that the first step is to do additional exploration and be able to build upon the information that we have already. And there are applications that are out there pending, and we're optimistic that those will be approved soon so that we can know really what the potentials are that are there. Another thing that we were very appreciative of and was pointed out is that the input of coastal states is something that is valued in the process. And so states through the Mid-Atlantic, through New England, through Alaska, through the Gulf, we have expressed the interest that we have there, and we're optimistic. I think, quite honestly, we would like to see more sales, and we would like to see sales earlier in the process. Lease sale 220, you may be familiar with, was scheduled in 2010, and it was canceled, or put on hold, and then ultimately left out of the current 5-year plan. So our optimism doesn't always pay off, but we're trying to prepare ourselves to be ready. We've just looked at facilities that can support the industry, particularly the exploration that needs to be done. We believe that's there. We believe there are new technologies such as directional drilling technologies and the like that can allow multiple uses of the ocean and minimize the footprint or the impact of the drilling and the production that's going on there. So we're very optimistic that this will move forward.
And so now that 2010 sale was canceled because of a major environmental disaster, which is I mean, a lot of the reason that people point to is why they don't want oil and gas development off their shores. What is Virginia's main reason for going for it? Is it jobs? Is it revenue sharing? I mean, what is the big push?
Okay, as we pointed out, we are an energy negative state, and so we import more energy than we produce. And so to be able to secure our state and our country, we believe we need to develop indigenous energy resources. And oil and gas is one that will be here for the long term. And so that is one major driver. The other is the jobs that goes along with that. So the military facilities in Virginia's coast is a major employer. But those same facilities can be used to support offshore energy industries as well. The shipyards are there, the construction workers are there. And so the jobs will go along, as we heard from Randall, that you take these types of infrastructure with you as you go into a frontier area and do the development. If it already existed with no development, then the egg would have been there before the chicken.
Right.
But in this case, the development needs to move forward, and then the jobs and the infrastructure will follow that.
And so this is an industry, this offshore industry, which would be starting relatively from scratch in Virginia, as opposed to something like the Gulf states where it's very firmly entrenched. I mean, what are the biggest obstacles you think that the state needs to overcome before it goes forward outside of actually holding a lease sale?
Yeah. Quite honestly, the industry is mature, the industry is mobile. I have a nephew who works on offshore oil platforms, and he travels to the North Sea. They come back to the Gulf, and so those platforms move wherever the drilling takes place. And so we expect that that type of activity can take place readily offshore, that there is no startup that will be needed for that. And once the exploration is done and you're able to prove the resource and you go into development, those first dozens of wells even can be handled by existing infrastructure. Revenue sharing will be important, though, to Gulf states, as it is in the Gulf of Mexico. And so to be able to put in the roads, to be able to build the pipelines, refining facilities, if we ever came to that, would be somewhere after 2030 or 2040, and revenue sharing would be important to the mid-Atlantic states to be able to move to that stage of development.
And there's also this OCS Governors Coalition that I think that you've been working with as well. What are some of the major differences you see between governors in states that are also looking to pursue oil and gas development?
Okay, as you might expect, governors are all different, but they do have certain common characteristics. One of them is service to their electorate and to the well-being of their states. And so each state will have its own perspective. One thing that is different in Virginia is for a number of years, our policy has been no oil and gas development within 50 miles of the shoreline for the possibilities of spills or some other type of activities going on there, but just for visualization, tourism, the movement of the ships from the ports, those kinds of things. Not every state believes that there should be a 50-mile set off of the coast. So there are differences amongst the states, but there are commonalities in their service to their electorate and the well-being of their economies. And so I think that that's what brings states together, but they also take their own initiatives as well. We also have congressional delegations, and there is quite a bit of support in Congress for some of the initiatives that we're looking at in Virginia as well.
And now you're also, speaking of other initiatives, you're looking at offshore wind as well. Is it possible to pursue wind and oil and gas at the same time, or can those coexist?
We just talked about that before we came in, that when you look at offshore energy, much of the onshore is the same. The welders and the pipe fitters and the laydown areas, those things are all the same. We've done 2 studies on both port gap needs for wind as well as for oil and gas. And we've came up with similar conclusions that the Mid-Atlantic is prepared for those industries as you're there. Another thing that you need to look at offshore is just the interaction, because offshore wind will be 24 to 35 miles offshore. Oil and gas would be 50 miles offshore. So there will be array cables and transmission cables from the wind turbines. There'll also be pipelines on the ocean floor from the production platforms and those things. And so you need to, from a GIS standpoint, be able to mesh that all together. In seismic work, there will be construction periods for the wind turbine installation, and there would be seismic arrays that would be pulled around doing seismic work, and the delay and interference there would be something that we'll be concerned about. So there are a lot of compatibilities that are there. Another thing we look at is all of this has to do with the geology. And there are potentials to look at these geology offshore as a carbon capture and storage area. And this would help in overall climate impact mitigation, as well as enhance the recovery of oil and gas. And so Virginia also is teaming with southern states now, as well as others, in looking at the overall geologic structure of the offshore for wind, for oil and gas, as well as carbon dioxide storage and production enhancement. So it all fits together in the same framework.
Great. And so get back to wind a little bit. Let's turn to Brian on this question. The same question. Do you see any conflict between wind development and oil and gas
No,
development?
as to use a specific example, we are building our foundations in a shipyard in Louisiana that's primarily been used to develop oil platforms. Those platforms, those foundations will be shipped on a barge that has been used to support the oil and gas industry. Those turbines, when they come over from Europe next year, will be lifted and placed on top of those foundations using a heavy lift vessel that's been used for the oil and gas industry. So all that's happening in a symbiotic measure. And so along those lines, I think from the standpoint of making sure there's no conflicts, making sure that it's done safely, making sure that it's done in a way that reduces costs, because the ratepayers of Virginia, the ratepayers of all the other states, we don't have those efficiencies in the system, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. That's going to prevent us from developing our offshore wind resource here in this country, because, quite frankly, it's very expensive. And so until we get the industry to support the development of offshore wind in a cost-effective manner, we're not going to have offshore wind. And so we've got to work together to use the resources we have, to use the capabilities we have, to use the infrastructure we have to bring costs down, so we can develop a sustainable resource that will supplant and coexist with our traditional sources of energy.
And so just getting into the sort of state of the U.S. offshore wind industry, maybe you could talk a little bit about deep water wind, where you're at, and also the big criticism, I guess, of the industry has been cost. Are costs coming down? You know, where is that going?
Yeah, I think the way to do that is really to look at the European experience and what's happened there. I mean, right now, today, and I pulled not to let facts get in our way here, but I pulled a few facts off the European Wind Energy Association website. 8,000 megawatts currently in 74 wind farms in 11 European countries, 12 projects under construction that'll produce 11,000 megawatts, 11 gigawatts of power. Prices will, right now, are at equivalent $160 per megawatt hour, are expected to drop down to the $90 to $80 per megawatt hour range in the next 15 years or so. Why has that happened? Because we've got now enough gravity, enough installation, enough runway that we're getting larger turbines. We've got a value chain of service supply vessels, of capabilities, of supplier parts and components that have brought the price of offshore wind in Europe down. That does not happen here in the U.S. We have no infrastructure other than the oil and gas industry to build off of. We don't have a turbine supplier that's going to build offshore wind components here in the U.S. And so where we are in the U.S. right now is probably 10 to 15 years behind Europe. We've got one 30-megawatt project of 5 turbines, a demonstration project, if you will. It's still a $300 million project, but it's a 5-turbine demonstration project off Block Island, Rhode Island. We had the Cape Wind project. After 10 years of litigation, got canceled. It is being canceled because it ran into a viewshed issue. So what we need to do in the U.S. is really get past two factors. One, if you look at the European experience, power prices are double where they are in the U.S. Natural gas prices are double where they are in the U.S. And so not only are we competing with a lack of an infrastructure directly related to offshore wind, we are now competing with fossil fuel prices that are low, and it, as Randall said, it benefits us when we go to the pump, but it makes the hurdle that much more higher to deliver offshore wind in a cost-effective manner, because we yet in this country do not have the policy mandate to consider socioeconomic factors in determining least cost energy platforms. Right now we look at a 20-year pro forma, what's our rate of return, what's it going to cost the ratepayers, and we come up with the low-cost energy source to build in our power plants. And what is that? That's natural gas. So if you ask any utility across the country and today, it's probably natural gas if they were going to build a baseload facility. If you look in Europe, it's twice as much. So now you've got a lot of headroom that supports the development of offshore wind, of biomass, of wave technology, and see what that's done. We've got 8,000 megawatts of offshore wind in US and Europe. So until we bring those, or until we get a policy in the US where we consider those socioeconomic factors of job creation, of price suppression, of carbon, climate change, until we bring those elements into the discussion and how we and analyze and select sources of energy, we need to overcome the fact that our fossil fuel prices are going to make the hurdle to make offshore wind competitive much more higher. And so I think we're at the point now where we need to build on the oil and gas industry, because that is basically our value chain. Until we can build on the oil and gas industry, create symbiotic relationships between suppliers, between vessels, between equipment components, that's how we're going to drive the cost down in the U.S.
And Rolando, you wanted to build on that?
Yeah, I do. But first off, you know, from a sustainability and impact client perspective, from a shareholder perspective, when we look at companies engaged in offshore drilling activities, we look at it from the standpoint of risk. Do we want that risk? Do we want to have exposure to that risk? For some of our clients within the sustainability and impact space, that is a risk that they're very uncomfortable with, particularly given the Deepwater Horizon incident and the potential environmental impact that you may have, especially now that there's discussions about, you know, activities in Alaska. That is something that for a certain shareholder base, and I think a growing shareholder base, they're uncomfortable with that risk. But let me take a step back, because there's a number of things that we're seeing, and we're seeing from a long-term perspective. Earlier this month, you had 6 large European oil and gas companies calling for a tax on carbon emissions. The reason for this is they want an efficient and predictable policy framework to limit greenhouse gas emissions, because they understand something needs to be done and they want to incorporate climate change science. Just a couple days ago, we had what I thought was a remarkable announcement from the G7 in basically lowering, I think it was 40 to 70% in terms of lowering their emissions by 2050. And then we are having what I think is a very important conference in December in Paris in order to discuss the potential for binding agreements from countries. Now, all this is basically directionally leading to possibly more compliance and more regulation around carbon. This is what we're trying to understand. This is the kind of discussion we're having with companies, and also in assessing if this is a risk, because there are companies out there, and what we're seeing is some inconsistencies. You know, is it right, or does it make sense to basically burn some of these reserves that are in the ground when science is calling for a certain threshold at 2 degrees Celsius, because of that could lead to consequences due to climate change. So these are things that I want to include into this discussion, because I think it's important when we discuss the long-term aspects and how shareholders, particularly our shareholders in the sustainability impact space, are viewing these issues. I think offshore wind is important, but in order to get to these ambitious goals, what we need to see, and from an opportunity standpoint, we have to see regulation certainty. That's one thing that we have not seen here in the U.S., particularly surrounding wind. When you look at the boom and bust cycles around the production tax credit, it gives us a bit of trepidation to actually invest. So regulation certainty is important from us in order to look at renewable space and see it as a viable long-term investment. But nonetheless, there are inconsistencies out there with regard to these ambitious goals. And the last thing I do want to say is, within our world, we need to measure. We need measurement tools. So putting a price on carbon for us, and you're seeing this also with some of these companies asking for it, I think is an important is something important that we need as a price discovery mechanism in order to be able to evaluate what carbon is, how can we measure carbon, and how can we price carbon to the point where maybe it becomes even more expensive, and it makes renewable energy actually become more competitive. I think that is something that could be developed over time. That's something that we think can gain traction.
So this is a jump ball to both of you guys, but if you're talking about this regulatory uncertainty and you're talking about this need for renewable development, and if the Obama administration is truly for a low carbon, no carbon future, in your opinion, should they be pursuing this, putting all their eggs in the renewables basket rather than trying to pursue oil and gas and renewables at the same time?
No, I mean, I think we need, I'm very much of an all above. I mean, we own natural gas power plants, we own waste coal power plants, we own wind, we own offshore wind. I think where it starts from a regulatory standpoint is, if you look with Conrad in the state of Virginia as an example, the State Corporation Commission, which regulates the utility, and the utility is going to do what's in the best interest of its shareholders, because it's a corporation, is regulated by the State Corporation Commission. The State Corporation Commission has been given guidelines and mandates under which it selects which projects get approved and which projects don't get approved, and how those projects are paid for. And they represent the ratepayers. And so until the ratepayers or the citizens of Virginia tell the politicians that this is what we want to see, we want to see a carbon capture tax, we want to see a carbon tax, we want to see a mandated RPS, we want to see whatever the measure is, the politicians aren't going to basically take that mandate and tell the state corporation commissions broadly across the country of what they want to see, so the state corporation commissions can say, yes, we want to see renewables, we want to see offshore wind because of these intangible factors. So it has to come from the people, it has to come through the politicians to drive the regulatory process. I don't think personally it should come from the federal process. I think states have a very much of a, because of the job aspect of it, because of the state waters aspect of it, because of the revenue sharing aspect. I think states have the mandate to do this, but it's got to come from us. It's got to from the population to tell the politicians what they want to see as part of their energy policy, and then have that work through the regulatory structure.
I guess, Brian, just to build on that a little bit, in the offshore wind demonstration project that Virginia has partnered with Dominion Power, our major utility, on, without going into how utility rates are set, there are basic rates and transmission costs and those types of things. But then in offshore wind and nuclear, there are called rate riders. And those are extras that are added on to your and my rates if we're in Virginia. And the project that Brian described at Block Island of $300 million, the Virginia project bid at $400 million. If you spread that over a 2.4 million customer rate base for Dominion Power, and you amortize that over, say, a 20-year time period, then you would be looking at probably each customer adding about $1 a month to their bill just for the construction. And then in offshore wind, operation and maintenance will be a high cost to that. So we have heard values from the utility of somewhere between 2 and 4% increases on the typical Virginia customer's bill. And those bills are about $100 a month. And so until you get to the point to where you and I, as the ratepayer, feel comfortable with those kinds of costs, then this debate will go on, or we can take the steps that we're taking now as well to try to bring those costs down, to reduce those risk factors that are built in there, to be able to demonstrate that the technology can be put in place successfully. But that's where it all begins, I think, is with each one of us in this room and what we are willing to invest in the moving forward of the energy mix and the energy technology in our country, in Virginia, as well as globally.
And I think that's an excellent point. I mean, when it comes down to it, what about every economy, what every country needs is a reliable, reasonably priced source of energy. And that's one of the reasons why I think we push heavily for all forms of energy, that you start spreading it out among the different types, so you're able to make some choices. But the reality is, I mean, when it hits the consumer level, you know, probably many people in this room can afford to pay more for their energy. I'm taking a wild guess there. But there, you get outside the Beltway, you get into a lot of different areas throughout even this country. A single parent, future, maybe 2 or 3 children, sometimes those utility bills are struggling. That's one of the things we have to keep in mind as we ideally, and I underline ideally, you know, head for certainly a less carbon future, but you've also got to bring it in where you keep a reasonable cost. And frankly, the traditional forms of energy for the foreseeable future are going to be the basis of that traditional cost. Can you look at it elsewhere to reduce the other impacts? Absolutely. You know, we talk about greenhouse gases a lot. Often that's the elephant in the room. But the reality is nature puts far more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere than man does. However, what man can do is increase the efficiency of the vehicles we do use and the mechanisms we use to reduce overall the amount of greenhouse gases. Should that be a goal? I think absolutely we should be looking at that. We should be taking it seriously. You do see areas in this planet where the weather patterns and climates have changed. There is no question about that. But does every storm that hits Washington, D.C. based upon climate change? Scientists will tell you no. But that still doesn't mean we listen, or that we do listen to it and take it seriously.
Great. So we are quickly running out of time. I just want to get to a couple questions. I'll just throw these out as toss-ups from the audience. What happened to geothermal and wave generation? Is that something that's still part of the mix? That's for anybody.
Go ahead, you can take a wave. Go ahead, John.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there you
sure.
go.
We have looked at wave, but we view it as a technology that is in its infancy. There are a number of projects around the world. What's very attractive about wave technology is that it's baseload power. And for utilities, baseload power basically means it's a consistent form of power generation versus wind and solar, which is intermittent. There is an attraction. I think what you're seeing are possibly niche aspects or niche uses for wind energy, for wave energy. But it's still very costly, and it'd probably take a number of years for it to get to some sort of commercial scale.
Geothermal energy is still out there, still being used. It doesn't have the scalability that offshore wind has. If you look at offshore wind, if you're going to inject large amounts of power into coastal states where the population is, and you're not going to build large transmission lines that bring power from the middle of the country to the coast, because nobody wants power lines running through their backyard. Offshore wind is how you're going to do that. Offshore wind allows you to build a gigawatt of power and deliver it right into the New York, Long Island area, deliver it to Massachusetts, deliver it to the coastal states. So I think offshore wind gives you that scalability, gives you that direct infrastructure that doesn't compete from a property value standpoint through transmission lines, number one. Number two, I think and from an offshore wind perspective, the interesting technology that I see out there is the floating turbine technology, that it's still in its infancy, but it has probably the most promise because it allows you to place turbines in deeper water where foundations don't work, where you have thousands of feet of water off the coast of Oregon, off the coast of California, where you have high energy prices, off the coast of Maine. I think floating turbine technology is probably the closer than wave technology as a way to serve those areas with offshore wind.
Great, and this is for Dr. Cruikshank. Wouldn't U.S. leadership in the Arctic be better demonstrated through a moratorium on oil drilling, consistent with the president's commitment to combat climate change?
Well, the administration's position on that has been that we need to be pursuing a future that that is low impact on the climate, but it's going to be decades until we're there. Right now, other countries, as Randall noted, are drilling in the Arctic. They're going to continue to be doing that. And if we sit and do nothing, which is certainly a policy choice the president can make, that's not going to lead other countries to stop doing the work that they're doing. We believe that that the Arctic can be explored safely, and we think that by demonstrating the right way to go about having that responsible exploration and development, that will show important lessons for other folks that are looking at the Arctic resources and other frontier areas about the right way to do things.
Great. There might be a high degree of difficulty in this one, but offshore methane hydrates have more energy potential than even crude oil. Japan is moving forward to commercialize this resource. Will the rest of the world follow?
We are actually doing research into methane hydrates in the U.S. government. Our bureau is partnered with the Department of Energy and others to look at both where they are and what the impacts would be of producing them. Right now, they are not commercial, so they're another one of those energy sources out there that have a huge potential to provide energy, but they're not cost competitive at this time. So that is a potential source, but it's years away.
Great, and this is a Virginia question. Given the strong presence of the military in Virginia, especially along its coast, what are the sets of security measures that will be taken, assuming drilling occurs? And can you speak to the relationship that would occur with industry and the military?
Yes, and I really want to apologize for not giving Walter compliments from the beginning on the stakeholder process that BOEM used for renewable energy. And at that point, we brought together all of the stakeholders, including the military. We have NASA, we have the space program that's involved, as well as the ports, facilities, and all of the military services that are there. In developing the research lease, there are portions of that lease that apply to the cooperation between the operation, construction of those wind turbines and military activities that are there sheltering in place during certain military activities, those kinds of things. What we believe that can be most successful is entering into similar memorandum of agreement between the military services and the operators and the permit issuing agencies. We believe that the stakeholder process could work very well for offshore oil and gas, just as it has for the renewables. I've mentioned earlier directional drilling technology, other types of technology that can minimize the footprint and the impact of those development activities that are taking place. We believe that the DoD fully supports energy development, and our experience in working through their process is that they are very willing cooperators in the negotiation process.
Great. And so I'd like to sum this whole thing up and just check with everybody on the panel on this. So it's 2015 right now. Gulf of Mexico production, oil and gas production seems to be increasing. Kind of on the precipice of seeing whether or not Arctic development's going to take place. Wind, we don't know yet. And there's also wave technology, geothermal. So if I could get everyone's sort of assessment looking forward 10, 15, 20 years, where do you see offshore energy development going? We can start with Brian on this one.
I see a viable offshore oil and gas production. I see that happening, and I think it's a reality, and it's going to happen. I think it's necessary. As you know, I'm a renewable energy guy, but 20% of the energy in this country is going to be renewable at best, 25% at very best. So we've got 75% of energy that we're going to need to provide conventionally. I think what you're going to see is two things. One, you'll see a tremendous growth with offshore because at some point in time, all of that technology, all that supply chain will come over from the UK and the European countries to benefit this country. And I think we'll start, as a nation, start including some of these externalities in our discussion of what is the beneficial source of energy that we need to be developing. And you'll see offshore wind gathering momentum there. We haven't talked about this today, but I'll throw it out there. I think the game changer for renewable energy in the United States is going to be battery technology. In a sense, it provides the storage capability that allows intermittent resources such as solar and wind to be turned into more of a base load, steady state capability at night. And so I think once you see technology developments, both from a turbine technology, wind technology, but also from battery technology, that because one of the knocks against renewable energy is it's intermittent. Once you start seeing a mechanism that allows that to be base loaded, you'll start seeing a lot more infrastructure being built around renewable energy.
Mine is a similar take. The couple things that I will say is that I do agree with technology. I think technology can be somewhat disruptive, I think in a good way, towards actually increasing that renewable energy mix. Energy technology is, for us, and when we discuss the potential for renewable energy, is really the holy grail. You know, can you actually store energy in a viable way? But the other piece, and I alluded to this earlier, is the potential for more compliance and regulation that will actually force the potential for more renewable energy. I mentioned a price discovery mechanism, or a carbon tax, or binding agreements starting to come from countries. I think if you do have traction, and I believe that can happen, you will see more of a push for low carbon sources, and not just renewable energy, wind and solar, but also maybe the development for natural gas, more so than what we see today.
All right, no, shockingly on my part, I hope to see a lot more offshore energy development, both in wind as well as oil and gas. And if you look at how the Gulf of Mexico is developed offshore, that is unlikely how Alaska, that is unlikely how the Atlantic would be developed. Because at the time the technology needed to be close to shore, it gradually moved out. There's now, with the use of subsea tiebacks, with the lack of visual things that you'll see on the surface, even the idea of a floating production storage offloading unit, which is actually just a big ship that takes it in and then moves it somewhere. It's going to be very different. In fact, most of you that live in the Atlantic, should you live along the coast, chances are you're not even going to see anything that even looks like an oil and gas operation. So I look for a future where we are providing a broad source of energy, several sources of energy. One of the things we talk about in the Gulf of Mexico is every year we have a hurricane season, right? Fortunately, you know, you hope it's never bad, but when one enters the Gulf of Mexico, you wisely shut down all production. That's what you do. So wouldn't it make sense to be able to back that up somewhere else?
Okay, and I'm sorry I don't have to cut you two off, and this is some. Okay.
I'd just like to say that I don't believe the future will be like my past. I don't think I'll ever be standing in line on gas rationing again like I was when I was in college. I believe that we will have adequate energy supply. I believe that the cost will be reasonable. And I also believe that we will continue to have improved environmental compliance, and that renewables will have a larger share. But I think from a standpoint, I'm very optimistic about our energy future.
Great, and we'll give Dr. Cruikshank the last word.
And I would just note, you put out a time frame of 10, 15 years, and I would say it's the decisions we're making today that will dictate what we're seeing in 10 or 15 years, that all of the projects we're talking about in Alaska, in the Atlantic, renewable energy, the decisions we make now, we're just going to be seeing the first projects, if any are successful, coming online in that time frame.
Great, let's give a round of applause to this great panel. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and let me pass on a round of applause for our moderator, Brian Scheid.
Absolutely.
Now, for those who want a break, we have a half-hour break. For those who have not gotten yet enough Capitol Hill Ocean Week, Capitol Hill Ocean Week continues on, not here, but with the studio programming. And you'll be able to watch it here on these monitors in the major room. And it's a wonderful session. Currents of Conservation, Managing Protected Marine Species. NOAA, particularly through NIMS, has been doing some tremendous work with their authorities under MMPA and ESA, as well as Magnuson. Eileen Sobek, the administrator, the assistant administrator for fisheries, is on that panel. We've got the commissioner of the Marine Mammal Commission, Dr. Francis Gulland, who's on that panel, and then Patrick Ramage, the program director for whales under International Fund for Animal Welfare. IFAW, as they have now recently branded themselves, but as we know them all, IFAW. So listen in. That will be a great session starting up in a couple minutes, and we'll see you back here in half an hour. Thank you.